The sugar industry once paid two Harvard scientists, overseen by a third, to push the evidence against sugar to the margins, roughly $68,000 in today's money, and in return, their paper would go on to help strengthen a low-fat direction that shaped American nutrition policy for decades. There was no requirement to disclose where the money came from, so almost nobody did. Sugar has been part of the human diet for thousands of years. Ancient physicians in India prescribed it as medicine. European royalty once displayed it at banquets the way governments display gold reserves today. But nothing in that long history compares to what happened to sugar in 20th century America. After World War II, cheap sugar and mass food production reshaped the American pantry. Soda, candy, and packaged desserts, once occasional treats, became daily habits, sold to families as small, harmless pleasures. By the 1950s, heart disease was killing more Americans every year than the country had lost in the entirety of World War II, and doctors were desperate for an answer. Two suspects kept coming up in the research: dietary fat and sugar. The scientific debate was genuinely contested. The British physiologist John Yudkin was one of the more prominent voices arguing that sugar, not fat, was driving the epidemic, and he wasn't alone. It was shaping up to be a real scientific fight, expert against expert, with the American diet hanging in the balance. The sugar industry was watching that fight closely, and what they saw worried them. Sugar wasn't just a pantry staple anymore. By the 1960s, it was a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year in the United States, woven into everything from breakfast cereal to soda to canned soup. What ordinary Americans couldn't see yet was how far that industry was willing to go to protect that business. So in July of 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation made a decision that would quietly shape American health policy for the next 3 decades. One that a mother we'll call Carol, standing in her Ohio kitchen more than a decade later, would never know to question. Carol isn't a documented figure, she's a stand-in for millions of households like hers. We'll get back to her. The Sugar Research Foundation didn't respond to the sugar heart disease research with a public relations campaign. They responded with science. They picked 3 of the most respected nutrition researchers in the country, all from Harvard. The assignment wasn't an open-ended search for wherever the evidence led. The foundation wanted a review that would push back against the evidence implicating sugar. Harvard professor Frederick Stare chaired the university's nutrition department, and he already sat on the Sugar Research Foundation's own advisory board. Through him, the foundation reached 2 more scientists, D. Mark Hegsted and Robert McGandy. The assignment, laid out in the foundation's own internal correspondence, later uncovered by researchers combing through Harvard's archives, was blunt. They wanted a review paper that would push back against the growing pile of research linking sugar to heart disease. One memo asked for a review of the papers finding some special metabolic peril in sucrose. Another, describing the foundation's real goal, was even more direct: research that would refute our detractors, not test a hypothesis. Defend a conclusion the industry had already reached before a single page was written. But what did that conclusion actually look like once the review reached print? The foundation paid Hegsted and McGandy $6,500, roughly $68,000 today. Overseen by Stare, the 3 men got to work, not running new experiments of their own, but deciding which existing studies belonged in their review and which ones didn't. It's the kind of independent research that comes with its own instructions. In July of 1967, the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most respected medical journals on Earth, published their review in 2 parts. The title, Dietary Fats, Carbohydrates and Atherosclerotic Vascular Disease. The conclusion was clear. Fat and cholesterol were the primary dietary threat to the American heart. Sugar's role was, in the author's own words, minimal. Nowhere in either paper did it mention who had paid for it. In 1967, journals didn't require researchers to disclose that. There was no requirement to tell anyone. Journals generally require that kind of disclosure today, a standard that didn't exist in the same form back then. The Harvard Review carried real weight in the sugar versus fat debate for years afterward, published as it was in one of medicine's most respected journals. Meanwhile, John Yudkin, the British researcher who had spent over a decade building the case against sugar, spent the rest of his career watching that case get pushed to the margins, his conclusions increasingly dismissed in favor of the fat hypothesis. His work was increasingly sidelined, while the Harvard Review gave the competing fat hypothesis enormous institutional credibility. That same trust, in a respected name over the underlying evidence, is exactly what Carol, a decade later, would extend to her own government. That single review didn't just win an argument in a medical journal. It became part of the evidence base that helped tilt American nutrition policy toward a low-fat approach, one that carried forward for decades. And one of the three men who wrote it wasn't finished shaping that story. A decade later, he'd get a much bigger platform to say it again, this time with the full weight of the United States government behind him. 10 years later, in 1977, the United States government released its first official Dietary Goals, the document that would eventually grow into the modern dietary guidelines for Americans. It called for less fat, less sugar, and less salt across the board. But its loudest, most repeated message, the one that reshaped the American pantry, was the one about fat. The nutrition scientist who helped shape that guidance was Mark Hegsted, the same researcher whose 1967 review had been funded by the Sugar Research Foundation a decade earlier. His earlier work had strengthened the case for low-fat eating. Now he was helping shape guidance that carried the full authority of the United States government. Picture a kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, in 1978. Carol, our stand-in for households like hers, stands at the counter, reading the side of a cereal box the way the government had just told every family to. Low fat, heart healthy. She trusts the label because she has no reason not to. She switches her family to margarine instead of butter, low-fat yogurt instead of whole milk, diet foods stacked too deep in the cart. What she can't easily see on that label is what often replaced the fat that was taken out. Carol's choices weren't unusual. Across the country, households making the same low-fat switch were trusting the same government guidance, and as manufacturers reformulated products to cut fat, many reached for sugar to help keep the taste familiar, in cereal, in fat-free desserts, in salad dressing, in products that had rarely needed sugar before. Nobody had lied to Carol directly. She had simply never been told the whole story, because the men who helped shape that story had a financial reason not to tell it. The consequences built for decades, mostly out of sight. It wasn't until 2016 that a crucial part of the story came into focus, when a UCSF researcher named Kristen Kearns, a dentist turned science historian, found the Sugar Research Foundation's internal letters sitting in boxes in a Harvard archive. The paper she published, with colleagues Stanton Glantz and Laura Schmidt, laid the entire strategy out in the industry's own words. Reporters had a name for it almost immediately: the tobacco playbook, applied to food. The evidence base that 1965 review helped build didn't just shape one government document, it shaped what healthy eating meant in America for the rest of the century. By the time that paper reached print, sugar had already found a quieter partner. New enzyme technology, paired with cheap subsidized corn, gave food companies high-fructose corn syrup by the early 1970s. Coca-Cola and Pepsi switched their signature drinks over by 1984, and much of the industry followed, sweetness getting cheaper and easier to hide, in a country trained to watch fat instead. That training is still visible in the numbers. Medical research now links excess added sugar to higher rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, the same disease the 1967 review downplayed sugar's role in. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 6 teaspoons of added sugar a day for women, 9 for men. Recent AHA data puts the average American's daily intake at roughly 17 teaspoons, nearly double. More than 40% of American adults live with obesity, per CDC data. Over 40 million have diabetes. None of this proves sugar alone caused it. Fat, sugar, and overall calories all play a role. But the same disguised sugar Hegsted's generation argued about is still sitting on shelves across America, mostly unnoticed, in a food system still shaped by a 50-year-old decision about what to worry about. What's changed is what people are allowed to see. Nutrition labels now list added sugars on their own line, the result of years of regulatory debate and public health advocacy Carol never had. Some places have started responding too. In Mexico, a national tax on sugary drinks was linked to purchases falling an average of 6% in the first year, a decline reaching 12% by the final month. For 30 years, the American public weighed sugar against evidence that had been quietly shaped by a hidden financial interest. A paid-for review and decades of silence about who paid for it were part of a larger, more complicated story about how that evidence took shape. Back in that Dayton kitchen, Carol wasn't making a bad decision. She was following the information she had, information that 3 scientists at Harvard had quietly helped shape a decade earlier. What the industry didn't want examined stayed buried, until someone patient enough went looking for it. Turn a label over today, and you can do what Carol never had the chance to: read past low-fat, find added sugars, and decide for yourself. The label tells you how much sugar is in the box. It doesn't tell you how decades of quiet industry influence shaped the way Americans learned to think about sugar in the first place, and that's the part worth remembering. Turning that label over used to be nobody's job but 3 men at Harvard. Now it's yours. If you want more stories about how yesterday's decisions still shape what we eat today, subscribe to Health Evolution TV.